Hi there everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. With me today I have Dave Clack, Matthew and a special guest. And today we will be looking at CatDV and hybrid deployments. But just before I hand over to them, I wanted to let you know that at the end of our webinar, we'll be running a Q&A session, so please feel free to send in any questions you have throughout, and we'll do our best to get through them all at the end. You'll see.
CatDV. TV for the cat.
So yes, thank you for joining us for this week's webinar show thing. We're going to be talking about cloud and hybrid workflows with CatDV and Docker this week, which is quite an exciting topic for us. So what are we hoping to do in the next few minutes? Well, we want to showcase the flexibility of CatDV, and as many of you will already know, we are pretty flexible when it comes to deployment, Mac, Windows, Linux, and we're adding Docker as a new platform for deployment of CatDV, which has a whole pile of benefits, and we have been making extensive use of it ourselves, and we expect many of our customers to do so too, and it's very, very relevant to cloud and hybrid workflows. There'll be there's a few new capabilities as well that are all kind of cloud and hybrid friendly, which we want to share. And as ever, look out for the You Can Book Me at the end, because if you do want to talk to any of the team about how to move some or all of your infrastructure, content, production to the cloud, whilst maintaining the best of your on-premise and remote working, particularly during lockdown, then book yourself in, and we'd be happy to talk about it on a one-to-one. Okay, so we're not going to make any apologies. This is going to be a bit techie this week. And so here's our agenda. I'm going to talk about the stuff on the left, and then Matthew's going to take the stuff on the right. So I'm just going to kind of very quickly recap, well, why cloud and hybrid, just to put the options that we've got into context, and then talk through some of the models that we've got for being able to move to the cloud, both for storage and for compute. And we're starting off with storage because so much in media workflows is storage based, right? So we need our creative folk to be able to access content so that they can do their work as easily as possible. And that means accessing content, finding it, getting it down to their local machines, perhaps, to be able to edit with it, and then being able to share that content back with the organization. Made even more complex, I guess, these days by remote workflows becoming pretty much the norm. And I suspect over the coming years that having to kind of go into lockdown, out of lockdown, being able to work at a facility and then having to work elsewhere from time to time is going to become more and more common. So we'll start off by talking about storage, and then we'll move on to the computing options as well. So, you know, where do you deploy your CatDV processing units, if you like, your server, your worker, and your data movers, and we'll talk about a few of the options there. So I'll talk about all that stuff. There's quite a lot of components of CatDV that we're going to be spinning up in different locations in some of these models, and that's where Docker really comes in. Matthew will talk about, well, what is Docker, a little primer on that, why it's cool, and why we think it's relevant. We'll talk about some of the things we've added to CatDV, so things like built-in SSL and some remote management built into the CatDV server and worker, which make it much easier to deploy in a hybrid or a cloud fashion. And then we'll take a look at stuff, and the demo is going to involve command line stuff, so it's going to be really cool. If you want to fast forward through those bits because that's not your bag, then that's also cool. So I'll try and whiz through the stuff on the left because we could spend ages talking about it. I'll try not to. So first off, context. Why are we talking about cloud and hybrid? It's just a reminder, I guess, because they're so hot at the moment. So cloud and hybrid deployments cloud deployment should make things simpler. So simpler in terms of hardware infrastructure. You don't have to buy so much stuff. You can avoid doing hardware refresh, particularly if you're thinking about storage and LTO refreshing between versions. And I mentioned earlier, remote collaboration. So being able to more easily work outside of a facility, irrespective of lockdowns or cancellations of lockdowns and such like. So hopefully you'll see, as we go through these options, you'll see that all of these things get delivered by many of these workflows. Now, some of the pictures you'll see and the architecture diagrams are going to get quite complicated. underneath it all and underpinning all this is a user experience for the folks actually using CatDV that hides away what actually becomes quite complex. When you've got these hybrid deployments where you've got storage, processing, both on-premise, in the cloud, and you've got users remotely that need to access either proxies or masters, that's really quite complicated. And CatDV hides away all of that complexity to its users. So the user just says, find me my stuff, get me my stuff, and doesn't really care where it gets it from. So while the pictures are getting complicated, the user experience stays nice and simple. So without further ado, I'm going to dive in. First off, a typical way that folks might start to take advantage of some of the cost and hardware avoidance benefits of the cloud is to start using the cloud as an archive location. We've been doing this for many years. We have plenty of cloud and object archive components that are part of CatDV. I'll put a few of them above me there, B2, S3, and compatible S3 devices, Object Matrix and Azure. And what this picture is trying to show next to me is that we have an on-premise CatDV system. We have some masters and proxies on storage. That's what those boxes are meant to be. We've got a CatDV server and a worker and a data mover. Essentially, that's the purple box. And then the little film strip icon I've got going on there is trying to show creative tools. Now, that might be the Adobe, Avid, Apple, or Blackmagic kind of tools that people use for video editing, or it could be the image editing and effects and sound kind of applications too. So, you know, got a non-premise system. You're starting to take advantage of cloud simplicity and cost. And so a nice easy way is to use the CatDV plugins to be able to copy content to a cloud archive, an S3 bucket or something. And we can do that in an automated fashion as part of an ingest or based on approval status or some metadata in our CatDV system. Nice and simple. Okay. Number two, second workflow is, let's imagine that we've already got some content in a cloud bucket somewhere, or let's imagine that we've got some workflows where our cameras are recording directly to a cloud bucket and we want to be able to handle that content. But actually, quite a lot of the rest of our workflow is happening still on premise. So we can handle that. And I think we showed that in an earlier webinar where we have some cloud indexing going on. We stick a worker up into the cloud. And that does the usual things that workers do. So it analyzes media, indexes it, proxies it, MD5, tags it, maybe throws it out to AI for speech to text or auto tagging. And then all of that metadata can then get stored in the CatDV system back on premise. The proxies get stored back on spinning or back on storage, back in the facility. And we've got a nice way of being able to ingest content that's kind of being born in the cloud into CatDV, either as a one-off or ongoing as new content gets thrown up into those cloud buckets. So just to note, having the worker up there doing all the analysis and indexing, with many of the cloud providers, that helps to avoid egress fees, so that if you can stick your worker up in, say, an Amazon EC2 instance or running a Docker container up in Amazon, then you can do all of this stuff without having to take your masters outside Amazon, which would, of course, then start to cost you quite a lot of money. So that's why we'd have the worker up there in the cloud. Next. Maybe a bit simplistic, but we can start to store proxies in the cloud. So both CatDV's desktop clients and web clients can use proxies that are not being served via the CatDV server from the CatDV server itself, but get then served from the cloud. So we can use B2 and S3 proxies. It's not a wonderful workflow. I mean, this kind of workflow would be able to take load off the CatDV server, because then your cloud provider can be streaming all of the proxies, and CatDV is just wondering and handling about all of the metadata. Quite a small load by comparison to playing some of those video files. So maybe a little bit useful, but not so much. It starts to become useful when you combine it with some of the other things we've already looked at, actually. So let's imagine we've got masters that are being ingested to the cloud, masters that are being ingested to on-premise storage. So you've got a flexible team that is creating content and throwing it into it's just the most convenient location for that new content to come in. And then if we've got our proxies up in the cloud, then it makes it much easier to have consistent storage so that those proxies and masters can be accessed no matter where you are, both on-premise, in the cloud, or remotely. So quite cool. So if you look at the picture, it's like, oh, okay, so we've now got our masters sitting up in the cloud and our masters on-premise. Well, I can see how to do my creative work on-premise. That's fine, because I can see my shared storage, my SAN or my NAS, and I can just work with Premiere or whatever. But up in the cloud, or if I'm remote, how do I start to do that? Particularly if I don't want to have a VPN and be dialing in. I don't want to use that kind of, I don't want to have the performance hit that gives. So how might we enable creative work? Well, CatDV gives several ways. The first off is really straightforward. The web client can unlock a download link for the masters that sit on cloud storage. So I can be sitting there in my home office like I am now. I'm using my favorite NLE platform, and I want to get hold of my masters. I go into CatDV on-premise. I search and find my content. I say, download, please. And then those masters will come down to my local machine directly from the cloud storage. Very good. Nice and easy. Well, not perfect, of course, because those masters that are coming down to my remote machine, they're not managed. They're coming into just a random location on my laptop. It can be a really efficient way of getting stuff done. It means I can do my renders remotely on my own machine. I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So kind of simple, in my control. Does use quite a lot of bandwidth, which might be costing you some money for cloud egress, but it works pretty well. So, and we know a lot of customers are using that as a way to be able to share media, maybe that's been born on premise, put it up into the cloud, and then you can collaborate and share it more easily when it's stored in a cloud bucket and unlocked with CatDV. So for those of you then would like to go a stage further, what this picture is trying to say, and I said they're getting a bit complicated, this picture is trying to show our pretty innovative remote proxy editing workflow that I think we showcased briefly on a collaboration webinar last week. In fact, next week's webinar is going to be all about CatDV and Adobe Premiere, and we'll cover this in more detail. But what we have here is a CatDV panel sitting up in Adobe Premiere with these remote users. And we can search CatDV, very cool. And when we choose to check out a project to our local workstation, then CatDV will download the proxies, either from on-premise or cloud, it can do either. And I can do a proxy-based edit remotely without using very much bandwidth because they're only proxies. And then when I check stuff back into CatDV, then we can do a render back at base when the masters are all accessible. And so you can see I've got a media encoder down there on the on-premise side, and we can throw things into a media encoder watch folder, say, whether it be a Final Cut XML file or whether it be a Premiere project file, throw that into a media encoder watch folder, and we can then create some automated renders using the masters, but that had been edited using a remote editing workflow. And it doesn't stop there, because of course we have content creators as well as people that just string things together. So if we're ingesting some local content, that might be some video files into my remote Premiere application on my laptop here. If I'm creating some FX or some sound effects or some stills or some lower thirds or whatever, then if we throw those into our Premiere bin, then the CatDV panel is clever enough to see that there's some new content and then to be able to push that back to the corporate repository. So we tend to push that right back to the on-premise SAN and NAS using our usual web upload technology behind the scenes. And then CatDV's worker can just handle that, bring it in and index it, which means that if I've done an edit on my machine here, and then tomorrow I want Matthew to pick it up, then any new stuff that I've created here, Matthew can then access back from the center when he checks out that project to his machine. So we think that's pretty cool. We know it's got a lot of use, and particularly in these last few months, our customers tell us so. So that's a pretty cool set of workflows, increasingly popular, I suspect, in the coming months and years. So that is 6 workflows. Okay, this is storage 6. So 6 workflows that are just really about CatDV handling the choices that you want to make about where you store your stuff, whether that be on-premise or cloud. And of course, we can add further layers of complexity or sophistication to this by adding things like LTO and tape-based storage, which can quite happily exist on-premise as well, or in your data centers. So So storage first kind of stuff, and some really cool workflows that just help unlock simplicity, unlock collaboration, particularly for remote teams using cloud storage platforms. CatDV can doesn't insist on working its way; it can work your way, and hopefully those 6 pages have shown you some of the options we've got. I've got 3 more, and they're going to talk about how we can start to move some of the CatDV processing pieces, particularly the server, around and about the place too. The first one of those is the master and AliCat workflows we covered in one of the CatDV shows a few weeks ago. And what we've got going on here is we've got an on-premise system at the back end. So we have maybe a central CatDV system that already exists called MasterCat. It's got some traditional storage. We've got a SAN for our masters maybe, and our proxies being stored locally, and our creative tools all on-premise. Brilliant. But let's imagine we want to share a subset of that content, either for review and approve or to share stuff with content creators. Maybe we're going to ship some stuff out to an agency to do some work for us that we've outsourced. Well, put a new CatDV system out in the cloud. Let's call it an AliCat system. By the way, we've done a big pile of work on security and hardening of CatDV. We constantly do every year. We get our stuff penetration tested, and if there are things that we find, we fill those holes, and we've just done a big pile of updates. In fact, it's quite funny listening to the hoops that our team jumps through and the different attack vectors they're all trying to protect against. It certainly would do my head in. Anyway, so we've got an AliCat up in the cloud. We're pushing a subset of CatDV media and metadata to it. And then we've got all the options for remote access that we've already talked about. So we can download masters using web links. We can use the Premier Proxy edit. And we can share links. For example, that little tick box is meant to be a review and approve style workflow through this cloud-based AliCat server. Something else that we know our customers can do with this kind of AliCat server is harvest content from the internet. So you can see I've got a remote machine up there with some local masters and some blue arrows coming down, which is showing content being uploaded to the central system. Well, so we might want to put some additional checks and balances around that. We might to quarantine some media. We might want to run some anti-malware on it before we start bringing it into the facility as a little back door, if you like. So, but we can set up workflows like that with AliCat. So we'd be able to ingest content. People could upload content from their local CatDV workstation using our web uploader. Comes into AliCat. We do some quarantining, some anti-malware checks on it. And then that content can get shared back with the on-premise system. As we talked about, and I won't talk too much about MasterCat and AliCat, but all the connections are initiated from the on-premise system to the AliCat system. So it's another layer of protection. If the AliCat was compromised, it has absolutely no access to the on-premise system. All the updates in both directions are initiated from MasterCat. So that just, if we are being super careful with security, which we are, then that adds another layer of protection. Okay, so that's number one. Quite simple, overlaying a cloud CatDV AliCat on top of an existing MasterCat system to enable remote collaboration and remote working. So that's pretty cool. Number two is talking about just having your CatDV infrastructure in the cloud. So not having a server on premise at all, but having CatDV still able to manage the media that is on premise. So in this instance, what we've got is a facility that's got some local storage. Maybe we've got our SAN and NAS. It's got the creative tools all there on the local network, but it wants CatDV to manage that content and perhaps to enable some remote working as well. So we can imagine having a CatDV worker and data mover on premise. That's the purple box in the on-premise system. That'll be analyzing, indexing, and proxying all this kind of content, storing all the metadata up to the CatDV cloud system, putting all the proxies on the CatDV cloud storage, and we've got a nice CatDV system that happens to be running in the cloud, but looking after content that's on premise. And you can imagine then overlaying creative workflows as we've talked about. On top of that, I've got, as you can see, the remote workstation has our own NLE going on. The Adobe Premiere remote editing workflow could work using all this stuff as well. So there's an option there to have CatDV in the cloud but storage on-premise. And why would you want to do that? Well, it minimizes hardware, so you don't have to have a CatDV physical infrastructure on-premise or in your data center. All of that stuff can be managed by other people. Okay, so that's the second one. The third one is having CatDV in the cloud and then storage in the cloud. So essentially, assuming that there is still a facility involved, but I mean, the facility could actually be a home office where you just basically use it as a way of ingesting content. So the on-premise workflow is all about ingest. You might have a little bit of edit storage, which is really there just to keep the NLEs happy because they can't work with cloud URLs at the moment. They all work with file-based paths and such like. So all we've got on-premise is a CatDV worker that is sitting there monitoring that storage, looking for new content, bringing it all into the main CatDV system up in the cloud. And there's CatDV happily sitting there in the cloud with the masters and the proxies all there on cloud storage. You can see I've added a box into the cloud layer for some shared storage up in the cloud. And that is, again, assuming that you want to do some creative work up in the cloud. Let's imagine you're using Amazon Workspaces or something, and you've got some Adobe Premiere running on your Amazon Workspace cloud systems. You want them to be able to access some file-based storage so that you can actually do your edits, and the CatDV worker can arrange for content to be moved to that local shared storage on the cloud, something like a EFS, in order to let Premiere do its thing, or Final Cut, or Media Composer, or Resolve. So that's kind of cloud-based, purely cloud-based creative stuff with remote access, as we talked about with all the other options too. Okay, so as you can see, we've got CatDV components popping up all over the place. We've got some on-premise, workers on-premise, workers in the cloud, and we got to thinking roadmap-wise. Well, we know there's going to be CatDV components popping up all over the place, and we might want to have them pop up for a while and then turn them off a bit. So if we're doing some cloud ingest, we don't want it necessarily to run all the time. So a couple of our kind of roadmap epics, we call them, are around simplicity and cloud first. And they really came together with Docker. That really helps us to deliver both of those things. And so this is probably the point that I should hand over to Matthew, who will talk about how we can use Docker to make some of these deployment models we've just looked at really simple to get up and going and really reliable and all that kind of cool stuff. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Dave. And very much it was part of our, cloud first strategy that we've sort of been looking at over the last couple of months as well. So I'll just share my screen so you can see that. Before we launch into the demo, I just wanted to give a bit of a sort of overview of what Docker is. I mean, some people may have heard of it, some people may be familiar with it already. If you're not, then I'll just give you a little bit of a brief overview. If you are, you can sort of have a snooze for the next 5 minutes. But effectively, anybody that's worked with software or software developers probably heard that phrase before. It works on my machine. You write some code, you test it with all the best will in the world, and then you deploy it on a different system, and it doesn't work as intended. And Docker was very much kind of created to try and solve that problem. So I think most people these days are fairly comfortable with the concept of virtual machines. So with a sort of VM architecture, you have some infrastructure, you have an operating system running on the bare metal, and you have a hypervisor. And very much in a virtual machine environment, what the system is doing is virtualizing the hardware. So each VM has its own virtualized set of hardware. It has a video card, it has, hard disks, it has graphics drivers, and then you install your applications onto those VMs in the same way that you would on a physical machine. And you can kind of extend that a little bit further. And I know people and companies that have tried that. So number one is you just install the app or the software, in our case CatDV, on your VM as you would on a physical machine. The second option, which people have tried with sort of mixed success, and some people have been quite successful at this, is to package up your application as a virtual machine image. So every time we release a new version of our software, rather than giving you an installer, we give you a virtual machine image. that would have that installer and have that software, and configuration built into it. But there's some inherent problems with that. One is there's different virtual machine image types. There are some open standards, closed standards. There's also different hypervisor technologies. And actually, because you're bundling in your image the operating system as well as the application, these images can be quite large. So normally these VM images are sort of gigabytes and not megabytes. So what Docker and containerization tries to do is come up with this standardized unit of software, which effectively allows us as software developers to isolate our application from its environment. And the way to do that is to basically create a package of software that includes everything that you need to run the application. So that's the application code itself, also any runtimes needed, system tools, libraries, and settings, effectively. And it will be no surprise to you that CatDV has supported VMs and Linux, for quite some time. But certainly in terms of Linux, not all distributions are created equal, and that very much led us early on to having a recommended distribution. So we say CentOS. The other thing is when you run CatDV on Linux, there are certain dependencies and libraries that you have to install as part of that configuration process. And we also found that it was quite difficult to have native codec support for all of the different camera formats and video formats, because often we have to bundle software developer kits and APIs and things like that with the software itself. So where sort of Docker and containerization comes in is rather than virtualizing the hardware itself, it's actually virtualizing the operating system. So you would have, your server, that could be a physical server or a VM. And on top of that, you run the Docker layer. So then your applications run in these containers, but they run with all the bits and bobs that they need to make them work effectively. That's the premise. So the other concept that comes up quite a lot when you talk about containers is this concept of state. And there's sort of big debates between stateless and stateful containers. When they were sort of first conceived, containers were designed to be completely stateless. So the idea is they would sort of pop in and out of existence as they were needed to do a particular task. They would do their job and then they'd sort of be disposed of. And therefore, the concept behind them is you should be able to, throw them away and recreate them. So in that concept, it's important not to contain state in the container itself. Now, for somebody like ourselves, where we've got a long-standing history and a very feature-rich product, when you move to these sort of technologies, you've kind of got a choice to make is whether you kind of re-architect from the ground up or whether you kind of pave the way to move into this. And we've very much gone for the latter approach. We've tried to effectively keep as much state out of the container as possible, where feasibly that's a good idea. So for us, most of the state is kept in the database. When you start a container, we need to inject sufficient configuration into that container to allow it to start up. So that could be things like the database configuration. And then ideally, once the container starts, it should pull the rest of the information it needs to operate from the database or the server itself. When you start to think about some operations like transcode, for example, sometimes it is useful to keep a bit of persistence for the life of the operation. So, for example, we might allow, or we do allow, you to mount storage into your container. So, if you've got your worker nodes doing processing, they can have shared storage between the server and the container. It depends on the platform and the environment that you're running in. But very much, we didn't almost want to bully people into always using object storage from day one. I mean, that's certainly an option, but we wanted to allow flexibility of people to deploy on-premise or in their own containerized environment, or even on a public container environment. So for us, the advantages we see from containerization are simplicity for deployment and upgrades and rollbacks, which hopefully I can demonstrate a little bit of today. Not tying people into a particular platform, so not saying you have to use a particular cloud provider or you have to use a particular hardware vendor. They also allow us to have hybrid deployment options, and they're hardware independent. So that was just a very, very quick overview of containerization. But sometimes it's easier to just show you what it looks like, and then you kind of get a bit of a feel for it.
Actually, Matty, so let me kind of interject a little bit. Thank you for the summary, if you like, of why we've done this piece of development. Simplicity, I think, is what it ultimately comes down to. So being able to make it super simple for folks to deploy, upgrade, spin up new CatDV capacity, no matter where they want to, whether it's on cloud, whether it's on Mac, Windows, Linux machines, cross-platform. Simplicity is the name of the game. So it's been quite fun doing the work. I think it's made us make some really good architectural decisions, just moving more and more to be stored securely in our database. So worker configurations and such like, being safely stored, much easier to back them up and such like. And, since we've had this technology, if you've been following any of these CatDV shows we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 months, almost all of our demos have been using this kind of containerized technology, and it makes it super easy for us to just spin up new systems. We're building our own CatDV system as we now have more marketing content ourselves. Really super simple to spin up new CatDV systems, move them from one platform to another, and particularly when, for us, we're running demos and engaging with customers on quite different workflows. It's super simple to just say, oh, run up a system because I want to show a creative workflow. Run up a system.
Hopefully we've got some resellers on today. So, if you're a reseller and you're watching, you may see, some benefits from this, maybe not necessarily in deployment initially, but maybe in the way that you demonstrate and kind of, show this CatDV as a platform to your end users. It's sort of, I have a joke with Dave that, every time he asks me to do a demo, no demo is the same. So, when I used to run CatDV on my local machine, I'd be constantly reconfiguring it and changing workflows and sort of importing and exporting things. And now when I run it in this environment, it's very easy for me to have almost 10 different demo systems, and I just kind of start and stop the particular system that I'm interested in. I mean, as a customer, that's not useful. But if you're a reseller, I think, that's definitely going to be a big thing as well.
But even in customer environments, being able to say, hey, I've got my 10 worker licenses and 5 of my workers are behaving in a particular way. Maybe I've got a whole load of new content coming in and I want a super fast ingest. I could just repurpose some of those workers to a completely new binary set of configurations. Say, oh, today I want those workers to be behaving as a big ingest station. Tomorrow, maybe a big transcode station. And, that stuff's so super easy. It's lovely. Anyway, let's have a look.
Yeah, okie doke. So what we're going to do is we're going to start a CatDV server. So this is kind of my command to do this, in Docker. So this is just a little batch file that I've written. We did warn you it was going to get a bit techy now. So effectively, what this command is saying is I'm going to run a new container, and I'm going to map the port on the host machine. In this case, it's my local machine that I'm working on, but I'm going to map port 7000 to port 80, which is running in the container. So 80 being the web server. We'll look at SSL a bit later on, but for now, I'm just going to use normal HTTP. I need to give the container a name. So in this case, I've called it webinar server. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to inject some environment variables into this container to tell it things like the registration code and the database that it needs to connect to. Now, in my case, the database is running on my local machine itself. You could run that database in another container, or if you're running in a sort of Amazon or Google environment, that could be a managed RDS type database where you just allow the public cloud to manage that database for you, and you just connect to that. Now, those of you who are more au fait with Docker will know that it's not best practice to be injecting things like database credentials and license codes in as environment variables, because they can appear in the logs. You'll see later we've got an example where we do that using secrets instead, but I just wanted to keep the first example as basic as possible, just for those who may not have seen it before. So effectively, here's my registration codes, and it's going to connect to my local MySQL. So I'm running MySQL engine on port 3306. And it's got the database username and password, and it's going to connect or look for a schema or database called webinar. Now, with the server Docker container, if that schema doesn't exist and the user has permissions to do so, it will go and create that schema. And if the database hasn't been installed, it will install it as well. When you run the container subsequently, if it needs to upgrade the database, it will do that at the same time. And in this case, I'm actually going to mount some storage into the server. So there's lots of different ways you can do this with Docker, and we could kind of talk about this in some ways, but I'm just going to mount something called a Docker volume, just so that I can have some shared storage between my server and my worker. There are ways you could do this completely with object storage, so you wouldn't need to have any shared storage between the server, but in this instance I'm going to. And then finally I tell it the image to run. So we have the namespace CatDV, it's going to be the server component of it, and then I kind of tell it the version that I want to run. So it's going to be 901 patch 12. So in order to do that, if I just flip to PowerShell, I can kind of just run that batch file. If I can, there we go. So that will now start up my CatDV server. You'll see sort of things whizzing past. It was actually installing the schema and starting up. And if I just open a web browser now on my local machine, I should be able to go to localhost, and I said it was going to run on 7,000. Okay, so there is my CatDV server up and running, and it really is as fast as that. If I didn't have I had the image cache locally, but it could have gone and fetched that from the internet if it needed to as well. So then I can just log in. I've got a very unexciting CatDV system at the moment, so it hasn't got any catalogs or configuration, but that's how quickly you can start up a server. And as we were saying, for the resellers and things, all you would need to do, for example, if you wanted to connect to a different database, is you could have, demo 1, demo 2, demo 3. You would just change the name of that database when you started the container effectively, and then it would start up and connect to a different database.
Or even you could decide to run 5 CatDV servers in Docker containers, each pointing to a different database, each with a different port mapping. And that would mean you could, on the same machine, have 5 different CatDV systems that had quite different looks and feels and purposes. So, and we do that kind of thing quite often ourselves, because we're, I guess, in the business of showing off our stuff.
Yeah, and then what I was going to say is I could now upgrade this. So, I could there's a new version of the server release. You want to upgrade to that. Traditionally you download the installer and run it. I find, with Docker, that's a much easier proposition. You can kind of, there's something called the Docker Hub. For those of you not familiar with Docker, just show you what that looks like. But effectively here we have the CatDV server repository here, and we've got different tags, so you can kind of see that there's the different images. So I was running P12. I can see there's a P19. Interestingly enough, on here there's some instructions to kind of help you get going. So we tried to help you out. I don't think we specifically said, did we, Dave? But this is kind of in open beta at the moment, so we're kind of inviting people to test it. It's not for production use yet. We want some more people to kind of work with us on that, but very much, as Dave said, we're using it actively internally. Here are kind of the instructions. It explains how to use a secrets file and things like that. So, if I wanted to upgrade my server now, so if we just check before we do that, if we log out here and just check, I think in Web3 it shows you at the bottom. Yeah, so we're running P12 at the moment. It'd be a case of me just updating this here to say P19 instead of P12. And depending what you prefer, you can kind of stop it in the command line. Docker are constantly improving the user interface. So this is showing me all the containers that I'm running on my local machine. So I can actually stop it here if I want as well, and shut that server down and delete it. So that will remove the container. And then what I would do is I just run my script again. You'll see it says it's unable to find P19 locally. So it's actually going to go and download that now from the Docker Hub. So it didn't have that image cache locally. So it's going to go and fetch that. If you're running in a cloud environment, this generally happens quite quickly because there's obviously high connectivity. So then it will start up the server again. And if I refresh the page, once it's started up, hopefully we'll see it's now running P19. So very small in the corner there. But if we go and look at the server dashboard as well, that should show us the version. So, in terms of managing software upgrades and things on your server, I think this has got great opportunity and great promise, really, because, As long as you've backed up your database before you perform the operation, you can kind of roll, you can upgrade, test. And I suppose we didn't talk about it, Dave, but this has implications for people that have test environments as well, that they sort of test upgrades and things before they deploy them. And as I say, you could just roll it back in the same way effectively. If there's been any schema upgrades, obviously it's worth taking a backup before you start that process effectively. But then you would just restore your database and you could just roll back. So that's how to get a server up and running. Obviously, my system doesn't have anything in it. It's not very useful at the moment. So I need to get some workers up and running. And the workers are kind of my processing engines, the things that are going to do the operations within my system. Now, when we were looking at the workers specifically, there's a lot of configuration that lives locally on the worker itself. And what we wanted to do is not have you inject all of that into the container at the point you start up the worker. So what we've introduced is this idea of cloud configurations for the worker. So effectively, the worker's configuration will live on the server itself. And for those of you familiar with the worker manager, this is the Pegasus worker manager. What you've got some new options in here now. So you've got cloud servers and you've got cloud configs. So I can go on and add a new cloud server. So if I say this is going to be webinar, and I'm going to tell it it's running on localhost port 7000, username and password. And it's now added. As you can see, I access lots of different remote systems, so that's why I've got so many in my list. What you can then do is you can go to cloud configs, and I can pick webinar, and it will actually connect not to the worker at the moment. We've connected to the CatDV server itself, and you can see I don't have any configurations because this is a brand new database. I've started from scratch. It was completely empty. You can either just press the plus button and start creating your worker configs, or we've also given you an import and export functionality to allow you to do that. So what I can do is I can import a configuration. So I created one earlier. It's on my desktop, I think. There it is, Ingest. And effectively, now we can start building our worker config. And this can be shared by multiple workers. So, as Dave was saying before, if you want to spin up multiple workers, then you can get them to use all one common config set, for example. So you'll see some of the options kind of say managed by cloud service. I need to give it a cloud service name. This is a name for the configuration. So I'm going to call mine Ingest. And I'm also going to change the service password so I can connect to it in a minute. Many things you don't need to fill in because these will be injected into the container, such as the license code and the location of the CatDV server. But this config that I've imported has two workflows. And what this is going to do is it's going to scan a Backblaze bucket and import that content. And then it's going to create some proxies and some film strips for me, effectively. So I'll just show you these configurations. So the first one is Cloud Ingest, and the watch folder in this case is square brackets high res. And this square brackets notation just means this is going to be a remote volume. And it's going to publish everything to a catalog in a production group called Cloud. So I haven't got a production group called Cloud. So I need to go and create one of those. So I'll create a new production group. For those of you not familiar with CatDV, a production group is kind of a way of segmenting your content. So catalogs are what we put clips in, and then production groups are what the catalogs live in themselves. So I've created a new production group called Cloud. And then if we go back to my worker configuration, you'll see that this is going to publish to a catalog, and this has got a variable in it. So it says $I and then square brackets 2. This just means the second part of the path. So this is actually going to be the folder in the bucket, basically. That's what that means. Once I've done that, I've also got my Cloud Ingest workflow here. This has got a couple more steps. So it's a server query. This means it's looking for a particular metadata state. So it's looking for any clips where the status is set to Cloud Ingest. And then it's going to reanalyze the media, and it's going to build some film strips, and it's going to build some H.264 web proxies. And finally, it's going to change the status on the clip to Cloud Import Complete. Now, you'll notice the proxy route for both the film strip and the proxy is just using a little asterisk or star notation. This is something we've added again to make it easier for you to build generic workflows for doing things like proxies and film strips. And what that means is take the proxy route from the media store. So I don't have any media stores at the moment, so I'm going to need to create a media store as well. So a media store just tells CatDV effectively where your media is living. So I'm going to create a media store called Cloud, and I'm going to tell it that the high res location for the media is square brackets high res. And this kind of means it's on a remote volume. So it will set that as the media path to tell it it's on a remote volume. My remote volume is called high res. And what we will then do is add a number of other paths. So I'm going to say the proxies are going to live in mount storage proxy. That's my path. The container is Linux based, so I've actually mounted some storage into there. But equally, it's perfectly valid to push those proxies back to another bit of object storage. That works as well. But I'm just going to keep them local to the container or local to the containers in my system. And I'm also going to add a film strip path, which I'm going to say mount storage film strip. Okay. So I've got my high res location, I've got my proxy location, I've got my film strip location. So this is kind of my configuration finished on this worker. The only other thing that's worth showing is the volume. So this is telling it about this high res remote volume. So it's a Backblaze bucket. It's giving it the key ID and the application ID. So as I say, I could have built that configuration from scratch, but I just imported it to mean you weren't watching me click lots of buttons all in one go. When I press OK, that's saved back to the server now. So I've got that config set called ingest, and this becomes important when we start up the worker container. So I've got another batch file. This time it's going to run an image called worker, catdv/worker. This notation : latest is saying rather than a particular version of the software, take the latest published version. It's just like a special tag effectively. And you'll see that I'm going to expose port 9000, which is going to map to the REST port on this particular worker. And then I'm going to give the container a name, and I'm going to inject some configurations such as my registration codes. And importantly, though, this config name here is set to ingest. So this has to match this config set that lives on my server. So when this worker starts, it's going to go and fetch that config set from the server, and that's the one it's going to load in the name of ingest. So in theory, if I've done everything in the right order, all I need to do is run that second batch file, which is called example2. So if I run example2.bat, it should start up the worker service. Now with the Pegasus remote worker manager, you can also connect to a worker that's running. So you can define all the different workers in your system. I've already defined it here. So mine is called webinar, running on port 9000. So I should be able to connect to that. And you'll see my worker is up and running, and it's actually got some tasks in it at the moment. So it's actually processing that cloud sync. So that first one where it was going to, start importing the content from that cloud bucket. So I just flip back to my web interface. You should see that it's starting to build some catalogs now within the production group that I created called Cloud, and you will see it will actually be creating some clips. So these are all the high res masters that I've got in that bucket. And once it's finished doing that, you should see it's going to start queuing some jobs. So now it's going to do the transcode and proxy generation. So you can see it's currently transcoding some clips. And once it starts to process through these, you should see we start to get thumbnails and then a playable proxy. So effectively, the server and the worker container are sharing some local storage for a Docker volume. And yeah, I'll probably stop that worker now because it'll just keep churning through otherwise, but I can just uncheck these. So as you can see, it's relatively easy compared to what people are kind of, used to sort of deploy a system. Certainly, in a first cut. We did talk about using secrets and SSL, so it's probably worth me just showing you that as well. We've got a little bit of time, so if I just stop my worker and remove that one on my server. And the idea is, because these should be stateless, I should just be able to throw them away, and I shouldn't lose any of my configuration because everything should be stored in the database. So just to show you another example, this time I'm going to run another CatDV server as a container. This time I'm mapping port 443 to port 443 in the container, because this is going to be HTTPS. And rather than me passing in the sensitive information as environment variables, what I'm doing is I'm setting one environment variable to tell the container to use a secrets file. And I'm telling it to look for it on this location here. So mint secrets.properties. But what I need to do is I need to inject that file into the container. So in my case, that's just a file on my local machine being the host. But obviously you can use, the different orchestration technologies like Kubernetes, or you could use Docker Compose, or you could even use the Docker secrets functionality to kind of inject that secrets file. So this is the file on my local machine, and then it will inject that into that location in the container. And the other thing that I'm going to inject into the container at runtime is a private SSL key, because I'm going to need that to encrypt the connection. So that's going to put it into there. So these are the environment variables that I'm setting. And effectively, everything in that secrets property has got all my sort of confidential information that I don't want to set as environment variables. So the theory is I should just be able to run my example 3.batch, and that should start up a server. This time it's going to be running on SSL. So we should see that it's exposing port 443 there. Because it's an SSL certificate, I need to go to a host name. So matthew.squarebox.com actually just maps to my local machine. But in that case, we should just see that we've now connected to our CatDV server. We've got our little padlock up in the top to show you that that's running. The other thing, just to show you briefly, is because we've started to move more and more of the configuration into the database. Those of you who are familiar with CatDV already are probably used to the server control panel. So if you're a reseller or a customer that's got CatDV already, we've now got this new section in the admin interface called server settings. So a lot of those things, I guess you were used to setting before in the control panel, you can now set through the web interface, and they're stored in the database. Things like license codes for your desktop clients. I think that was everything I wanted to show today, Dave, really. I know it was a very whistle-stop tour, but, just to whet people's appetites, really. That was the idea.
That's great. And look, we decided to be a little bit ambitious on this one. There was just quite a lot of content that we wanted to share, me trying to give the so what about actually, being able to deploy CatDV and spin things up and spin things down to be able to enable cloud and hybrid workflows better, and then showing all this cool new stuff, hopefully in enough detail to give a real sense of what we've built and how it's useful. So we haven't just skimmed through all that stuff. I mean, ultimately, let me just head back to sharing the screen out again.
Oh, sorry, let me stop.
That's all right.
It's like past the sharing, isn't it? We play in Zoom.
So when we kicked this off, I said, look, the reason we were mainly doing it was simplicity and cloud first, part of those epics. But then it's really hitting some of our ongoing epics that kind of following on from those, all around things like scale and resilience. Being able to do load balancing, having multiple workers that run on certain configuration sets, being able to turn more of them on, almost on demand, currently manually, but that may well change in the future. Being able to run multiple CatDV servers behind a load balancer, so we get some additional scale for users and such like, and some resilience in case of failures. So all of that, and then all of that kind of boils down into kind of elasticity. And so being able to flex up and flex down the kind of capability and capacity that's in CatDV. And so you can kind of see we absolutely have, and we're very proud of our evolutionary iterative approach to CatDV. That's what we've always done. CatDV does get better with every release, which is not the case for many products out there. and we improve it in small pieces constantly, which we release very, very quickly. And that evolution and that iterative approach is great. And you can see where, with these kind of topics, you can see the kind of direction that we're heading with some of these technologies. It's
just to pick up on elasticity, Dave. Elasticity for asset management systems is a really interesting topic, because I guess if you're building a web app, a pure web app, or I don't know, say a ticket booking system or something like that, your key sort of metric is that everybody can be served. So people coming onto your website or your app can book tickets, and basically you serve the number of requests that come in. So that's quite an easy thing to sort of scale up, isn't it? As more users come on, you kind of spin up more servers, and you kind of cope in that way. When it comes to sort of asset management system, there's quite a lot of things happening under the hood, like transcodes and file moves, and then elasticity becomes a bit more interesting, because is it a case of just doing everything as fast as possible? So if we allowed you to, you could spin up 10,000 worker nodes and get that all done straight away. But obviously, if you're running in the public cloud, the credit card's going to get a big bill at the end of the month because you've just done everything as quickly as possible. So then you get into looking at things like spot instances and bidding, for operations. So actually, you might have two transcode queues. You might have things that you want to transcode as quickly as possible, but you might have other things that are kind of less urgent and you want to transcode, but you've almost got a tolerance for what you're willing to pay for that operation. And there's work to be done there, but that's the sort of stuff that we're thinking about at the moment, is how do you metricize and how do you orchestrate this in ways that allow you to be more flexible in your operation, so you don't just do everything as fast as possible all the time. Because I think for an asset management system, that's probably not the right answer.
Well, and that's a good segue into get in touch, right? So we desperately like listening to our customers and our partners about what they'd like to see CatDV do. We've got clearly plenty of ideas as the pioneer and thought leader in many of these technologies since our inception. But we definitely love listening to what folks might want to do. And that elasticity thing, would you value fast transcodes or cheap transcodes? That is an interesting kind of discussion we'd like to have. And so the encouragement is book a one-to-one with us. catdv-cloud.youcanbook.me will be open shortly for next week. Please do, if you want to talk about moving some or all of your CatDV infrastructure to the cloud, or adding Mastercat, or really just talking about the possibilities of how creative workflows can happen and how storage can be aligned with people that are working remotely, then do take advantage of that. These are proving enormously popular. We're very pleased to be offering free consulting, if you like, but it's a really great way of us being able to connect with our customers and partners whilst we're on lockdown, all of us around the world. So we'd encourage that. And CatDV Docker is in open beta. You can find it actually on the Docker repo. Just you can go use it, and the instructions are there. We're not suggesting you do that in live environments without our help. It is the same code as runs in normal CatDV, so we're not scared of putting it live. It's just we'd like to be there and watch it and handhold it and support you in getting it live if you want to get live with Docker deployment to CatDV. So do get in touch. sales@squarebox.com, dave@squarebox.com, matthew@squarebox.com. On this particular topic, it's kind of fine to talk to us directly because it's something we're both quite passionate about. So yeah, we've spent an hour talking, not much. We might go for a few more minutes just in case people can stay on and want to ask questions. Plug for next week. It turns out our Premiere workflows are world leading, and we do stuff that nobody else does. And so we're going to take a bit of a showcase into the way that we work with Premiere, Media Encoder, and really step through some of the cool stuff. In fact, we even last week, we were adding some new capabilities and functions because we can see that our customers really need them. So we'll be showing some of that new stuff in addition to showcasing the stuff you may be familiar with already. Certainly that proxy-based workflow that we talked about today. So let's try, if anyone that's still on that does want to ask any questions, then please do type your questions into the Zoom panel. And Hannah, maybe you could help MC some of them for us.
Yeah, of course. We've had quite a few questions come in, so I don't think we're going to have time to get to all of them, but I'll go through some of the more generic ones, and like Dave said, a few If we don't get to your ones, then please feel free to book a meeting with the team. So the first question, what versions of CatDV do you need to be able to run in the cloud?
So if you're going to be running with Docker, then certainly the more recent ones, so the Server 9 and onwards. If you're going to be just deploying CatDV using virtualization technologies and running on Linux and Windows in the cloud, then it's really quite flexible. And Matthew, I probably should let you answer that better than me, but yeah. I think
No, yeah. In terms of versions of software, I mean, with Docker, you can only run what we've published, so it's kind of whatever's in the hub. Generally, we're sort of pushing builds fairly frequently at the moment. But yeah, as you say, if you're just in a sort of virtualized environment, then maybe people were wondering what was sort of enterprise versus Pegasus. I think that was the question.
Yes. Yeah.
So to use the worker remote configuration, it does need to be a Pegasus worker node. So that kind of makes that remote workflow work a lot better because you need to be able to connect to it with the worker manager, really. I don't know about the server side of things. I don't know if there's a requirement there.
I don't think there is technically. Yeah.
No, not that I'm aware of, but no.
Great. So then next question is, can I use my existing system and migrate it up into the cloud?
Sure. So, that needs a consult, right? So that needs so either ourselves or our good friends at North Shore or some of our tier 1 reseller and integration partners around the world. So just being able to work out, what have you got it already? I mean, I said at the beginning, everything starts with storage. So if we can start to understand better your creative workflows and how what is the content you're trying to create? Is it video content? How do you want your editors to get hold of the masters to be able to do a render? Are you going to do that remotely in the cloud with a media encoder or something, or a Vantage? Are you going to have some on premise? So we need to have that. So absolutely, yeah, we can help with migrations into the cloud, and our partners can. We love those kind of conversations. Yeah.
And certainly something I've liked about working at Squarebox is if you bought a license, we don't sort of try and get migration is something we can help out with, isn't it? We're not sort of trying to be sort of difficult and say, oh no, you need to buy again, to migrate.
And just a couple more questions then. So what operating systems have been tested to run CatDV in the cloud? Is Amazon Linux 2 supported, or do you recommend Windows Server or CentOS?
Well, I know in Amazon specifically, we've got customers with a virtual environment that are running on Windows Server and CentOS. I don't know if anybody's deployed with Amazon Linux flavor, and I'm not sure. I know I certainly have validated that. So.
We try and keep ourselves sane and not follow all the different versions of Linux. I think are we Debian based? Is that right? So CentOS and Red Hat.
Red Hat based. Yeah.
We work with. I know we are. I think there's an Oracle Linux which is also Debian based. I might be getting the wrong term. So official support is CentOS and Red Hat. If you want others, do talk to us. We will probably try and encourage you to use Docker because we try to be lean as a team and not just explode everything that we offer. But of course, it's hard to say no if someone's got money as well. So yeah, talk to us.
Okay. And I think probably one more question. So Dave, you mentioned a data mover to move data between on-premise and the cloud. Is that a worker node instance for moving the data?
Actually, it's not. It's a CatDV server running as a container, running our archive plugins, and we're doing some cool stuff at the moment. Actually, that allows us to run several data movers at a time. So again, it's all part of this scale and scale, simplicity, cloud first, load balancing, resilience thing. We have some customers with some particularly immediate and large data movement requirements that cannot go wrong, and so our data, our archive plugins, whether they be to object or cloud or LTO based systems, whether we're talking an Archiware or a Black Pearl or an S3 or an Object Matrix or a B2 or an Azure blob storage thing, being able to run essentially several CatDV servers. None of them are doing metadata management. All of them are containers for these data movers that can then squirt data as fast as we can up through using our S3, B2, Black Pearl, Quantum, all those kind of normal connectors that we've got for shipping data around.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. As I said, if you've got any other questions, feel free to send them into sales@squarebox.com or you can book me a meeting link. It will be on the email that I'm hopefully sending around tomorrow or earlier next week. So definitely book up with our team for that. Otherwise, thank you all for taking time to join us today, and we hope to see you again at one of our upcoming webinars in the next couple of weeks.
Super. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Okay, bye-bye.
CatDV.